Russian President Vladimir Putin slammed NATO and the West in his State of the Nation address today. US President Joe Biden lauded NATO as the most consequential alliance in the world.
The United States needs Poland and NATO as much as NATO needs the United States, because there is no way in which, for our ability to operate anywhere else in the world and our responsibilities extend beyond Europe, we have to have a security in Europe. It's that basic, that simple, that consequential. So it's the single most consequential alliance, I would argue, maybe the most consequential alliance in history, that not just modern history, but in history.
To Poland, Biden met with President Andrzej Duda in Warsaw. The two leaders discussed collective support for Ukraine. Biden promised to bolster Warsaw's security for generations as he thanked Poland for its support of Ukraine. Polish President Duda said Biden's visit was an important sign of the United States' commitment to maintaining security in Europe.
For all of us, this is an extremely important symbolic visit here in the region. We do not perceive it as Poles as a visit to us. This is a visit to our region. Combined with the visit to Kiev, this is a very strong signal of the responsibility that the US constantly assumes for the security of Europe and the world.
Biden is rallying NATO allies in Poland to demonstrate that the United States is squarely behind Ukraine and is committed to bolstering the alliance's eastern flank. Biden arrived in Warsaw late on Monday following a surprise visit to Kiev. Before returning to Washington on Wednesday, Biden will meet leaders of the Bucharest Nine to reaffirm support for their security. The Bucharest Nine countries are those on NATO's easternmost flank. All right, my colleague Susan Tehrani now joins us live from New York to shed more light on this important visit. Susan, these visits by President Biden are obviously pregnant with significance. First, that surprise visit to Kiev, and now Poland on the eve of the first anniversary of the Ukraine war. And he has reaffirmed the United States' commitment to supporting not only Ukraine, but all of America's allies. What can we expect from the speech that President Biden is about to make in Warsaw a short while from now?
Right, Neha, as you mentioned, this is a speech that's going to really focus on trying to garner support for democracy against autocracy. This is the Biden doctrine that has been prevalent really since the beginning of his administration and since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's something that has garnered support until now. And as we're trying to really understand how President Biden wants to continue to garner this support moving forward 1 year on, as we're seeing some cracks here in the United States regarding that support, notably among the American people, we're expecting once again for President Biden to try to appeal to the American population that this war and this support to the Ukrainians is in the interest of America as well, that democracy prevailing in Ukraine miles away is detrimental to the security of America as well, and pouring in this money into Ukraine ultimately in the long run will be beneficial to the safety and security of the United States. But President Biden will also have another audience, and that will be in Europe. And while he will pat Europeans on the back for their support, and he'll pat himself, of course, on the back for bringing Europe together and NATO allies together in its fight against Russia. One thing is clear: without the United States, other European countries really wouldn't have come together the way that they had in really pushing back against Russia. Although we do know that in the past year, Europe really didn't divorce itself completely from Russia oil, despite the sanctions and whatnot. And then there are other audiences in Ukraine and in Russia as well. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that this speech is not going to be a rebuke and defensive against Russia, despite the fact that just hours before, Vladimir Putin did make that speech a very stark announcement that Russia was going to pull back from the START arms treaty. Still, President Biden is expected to not really address that on the one hand, and is not going to really address the fact that the U.S. just days before said that it had intelligence that China is planning on providing lethal aid to Russia in its fight against Ukraine. Again, China has pushed back regarding those allegations. So a lot of rubric cubes at play here, but the president really, his main focus is going to really be that democracy has to prevail in Ukraine. And one other thing, despite the fact that many, 1 year on, are talking about some form of realism moving forward, whether it's ceasefire, some sort of concession in terms of finding a peaceful solution, a negotiated solution where Ukraine can also feel victorious, whether it's, trying to find a way into the European Union, while Russia also has some sort of territory. On the other hand, President Biden is not expected to address any of that as well. He always says and will say, according to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, that any peace deal about Ukraine is going to be in the hands of the Ukrainians, and Americans are just there to provide support. But I will say that the argument and the sounds are getting louder and louder that the United States and the West has to really have a more realistic approach moving forward regarding this conflict, because, as I mentioned, support for it is waning here in the United States. We're not really talking about it as much, but ultimately, another year of this is going to be very different from the year past, especially if we're talking about Russia coming out of the nuclear START treaty, if China wants to get involved. And then we're talking about, the United States just pouring money, and the Pentagon saying that, outright really admitting that it's